Hello readers, we're continuing with chapter 16 of The Sign of the Beaver. Okay, if you recall from chapter 15, Aten and Matt had that scary encounter with a bear cub and the bear cub's mom, and they were able to escape that danger. Chapter 16. In the late afternoon, Matt sat in the cabin doorway. He couldn't think of any work to do. He felt restless, the excitement still jumping about inside of him. He needed to talk to someone. He wanted to tell his father about the bear. Thinking of his father, he felt the snake of worry crawling about behind every other thought. That worry was becoming more frequent every day. What could have kept his father so long? Suppose some accident had befallen him. The meeting with the bear had shaken Matt's trust in the forest. Now it seemed too close. It seemed to close him in on every side, dark and threatening. Suppose his father had met with a bear. Suppose he had never got back to Quincy. How would his mother know where to find this place, or even where to send anyone to look for him? Matt hugged his arms around his chest, but the cold was inside. It would not go away. Something moved at the edge of the woods. Matt leapt to his feet. A stranger came walking into the clearing. With an ugly chill against his backbone, Matt stared at the hideous painted face. Then he recognized Aten, a very different Aten from the boy who had walked with him in the forest that morning. The Indian boy had washed his body and had shone with fresh grease. He had combed his tangled black locks. Down his cheeks on either side on his forehead ran broad strokes of blue and white paint. On a cord around his neck dangled a row of new bear's claws. In case Aten had noticed his first alarm, Matt greeted him boldly. "What's the war paint for?" he demanded. "Not war paint," Aten answered. "Squaws made feast with bear. My grandfather say you come." Matt hesitated, unable to believe his ears. It took him a moment to realize that this was actually an invitation. "Thanks," he stammered. "I'd sure like some of that bear meat. Wait till I get my jacket." "Shut door," Aten reminded him. Maybe another bear come. Aten was in good humor. He had made one of his unexpected jokes. "Long way," Aten said. After a time, Matt was certain they must have been walking fast for more than an hour. He remembered that Aten had already walked all this way to fetch him, and he kept silent. It was so dark now that he could barely see to put one foot before the other. But he realized that they were on a well-beaten trail. Just as the last light was glinting above the tree tops, they reached a riverbank. Drawn up on its edge was a small birch canoe. Aten motioned him to step into it. Then he gave a push and leaped nimbly into the stern. His paddle moved soundlessly, grateful to sit still. Matt was entranced by the speed, the silence, the gliding shadow on the silver river. He was regretful when in a very few strokes he reached the other side. Now Matt could see a glimmer of light deep in the woods. Aten led him toward it, and presently their way was barred by a solid wall of upright posts, a stockade. For the first time, a quiver of uneasiness made Matt falter. But stronger than any doubt, curiosity drove him on. Not for one moment would he have turned back. Eagerly, he followed Aten through a gateway into an open space filled with smoke and moving shadows and wavering patches of light cast by birch bark torches. All around him in a circle rose the dim shapes of cabins and cone-shaped wigwams. In the center of the circle, a long, narrow fire was burning between walls of logs. Suspended on timbers hung 3 iron pots, sending up rosy curls of steam in the smoky air. The fragrance of boiling meat and pungent herbs made Matt's stomach crawl. Then he was aware of the Indians. They sat silently on either side of the fire, their painted faces ghastly in the flickering light. They were clad in an odd medley of garments, some in Englishmen's coats and jackets, others with bright blankets draping their shoulders. A few had feathers standing straight up from headbands. Everywhere there was a gleam of metal on arms and chests. Women in bright cloth skirts and odd pointed caps moved about without a sound, adding wood to the fire or stirring the contents of the kettles. Light glinted in their silver armbands and necklaces. Clearly the Indians had put on their finest array for this feast. It came over Matt with a rush of shame of how shabby he must look in their eyes. Even if Aten had warned him, what could he have done? He had no other clothes to wear. Probably Aten had known that, and so had said nothing. No one seemed to notice him, yet he was conscious of the unblinking stare of the row facing him. The others did not turn their heads. They seemed to be waiting. In the silence, Matt's heart beat so loudly they all surely must have heard it. After a long pause, one man rose slowly and came towards him. It was Saskinus, his paint-streaked face barely recognizable. He wore a long red coat decorated by a handsome beaded collar and metal armbands. A crown of feathers rose from the beaded band around his forehead. He stood very tall, and there was pride in his stern features. Why, Matt thought, he looked like a king. Queeb, Saskinus said with dignity, "White boy, welcome." In a sudden, terrifying yell, the rows of Indians echoed this greeting. "Tabo," they shouted. "Tabo, ye bye-bye." "Kawib," Matt stammered in return. Then, more loudly, "Kawib." The Indians seemed satisfied. Smiles flashed in their dark faces. There was rough laughter, and then, seemingly to forget him, they began to jabber to each other. From nowhere, children suddenly crowded around him, giggling, daring each other to touch him. Matt's heart slowed its pounding. There was nothing to fear in this place, but after the weeks of stillness in his cabin, and all this noise was confusing. He was grateful when a teen came to his rescue and led him to a seat at the end of the log. An old woman approached and held out to him a log. An old woman approached and held out to him a gourd cup. It contained a sweetish drink, acid and flavored with maple sugar, good on his dry tongue. Saskinus raised his arm, and instantly the clamor was silenced. There was no doubt Aten's grandfather was the leader here. An Indian brought him a long pipe, and Saskinus put it to his lips and slowly blew out the long wreath of smoke. The rows of Indians waited respectfully for him to speak. Instead, the old man turned to his grandson and held out the pipe. Aten stepped into the center of the clearing. In the firelight, he stood straight and slender, his bare arms and legs gleaming. Matt had never seen him like this. Proudly, he took the pipe, set it briefly to his own lips, and handed it back to his grandfather. Then he began to speak. Matt did not need to understand the words. He soon realized that Aten was recounting the morning's adventure. Watching his gestures, Matt felt himself living again the walk through the woods, the meeting with the small cub, the fearsome mother about to charge. As Aten spoke, the Indians urged the boy with grunts and shouts of approval and pleasure. Aten tensed his body. He uttered a sharp cry, pointed at Matt, and made a flinging sweep with his arms, hurling an imaginary rabbit. The seated figures broke into loud cries, shouting, "Hee!" Grinning and pointing at Matt, swinging their arms in imitation. Matt's cheeks were hot. He knew they were making fun of him. But boisterous as it was, the second it sounded was friendly. Now, they turned back to Aten and followed his story with growing excitement. Aten certainly made a very good story of it. His telling took a lot longer than the actual event. Plainly, they all enjoyed it, and in listening, they were all taking part in it. Aten was skillful storyteller. Matt could understand now just how he must have delighted them with the acting out of Robinson Crusoe. When the narrative was over, the Indians sprang to their feet. They formed a long line, then began a sound that sent a tingle, half dread and half pleasure, down Matt's spine. A lone Indian had leapt to the head of the line, beating a rattle against his palm in an odd stirring rhythm. He strutted and pranced in ridiculous contortions, for all the world like a clown in a village fair. The line of figures followed after him, apping him and stamping their feet in response. Aten was at his side again. "Dance now," he said. "The feast." The rhythm of the rattle quickened. The line of figures wove around the fire, faster and faster. Women joined now at the end of the line, linking their arms, swaying. Finally, the children, even small children, were dancing and stamping their naked feet. Dance, Aten commanded. He seized Matt's arm and pulled him into the moving line. The men near him cheered him on, laughing at Matt's stumbling attempts. Once he caught his breath, Matt found it simple to follow the step. His confidence swelled as the rhythm throbbed through his body, loosening his tight muscles. He was suddenly filled with excitement and happiness. His own heels pounded against the hard ground. He was one of them. He came back to the earth with a stitch in his side. His legs threatened to give way under him. The dancing seemed to have no end. Determined that Aten should not see him weakening, he moved faster and stamped harder. Finally, when he felt he could not make the circle one more time, the dance ended. The feasting began. The squaw brought him a wooden bowl filled with thick, hot stew and a curiously carved wooden spoon. The first streaming mouthful burned his tongue, but he was too hungry to wait. He thought nothing had ever tasted so good. Dark and greasy and spicy. So this was bear meat. Presently, he noticed that Aten sat beside him, eating nothing. "You're not eating?" he said with a sudden doubt. "Have you given me your share?" "This my bear?" the boy answered. "I kill, not eat. Maybe not get any more bear." He didn't sound as if he minded in the least, as if, in fact, he was proud of not eating. When Matt's bowl was empty, the squaw refilled it. By the time he finished, sleepiness began to drag his eyelids. He could scarcely hold them open. Aten seemed in no hurry to leave. The Indians were enjoying themselves, refilling their bowls, shouting at each other, laughing and slapping their legs at whatever seemed to be uproarious jokes. This was noisier than any celebration Matt had ever seen in Quincy, even on Munster Day. Why had he ever had the idea that the Indians were a dull lot? At last, however, they fell silent, and Matt saw that one of them was beginning another story. It promised to be a long one. Between the sentences, the speaker drew on his pipe, and the smoke curled from his nose and mouth as he spoke. Matt's head drooped and came up with a painful jerk. He had almost fallen asleep sitting up. Aten laughed and motioned him to his feet. At the thought of trampling all the way back to the cabin, Matt groaned. It must be close to midnight. Then he saw that Aten did not mean to go back. He led Matt towards one of the wigwams and pulled back the flap of deerskin that hung across the door. Inside, a small fire burned, and by its faint light, Matt saw a low platform covered in matting and fur. Aten made a silent motion, and Matt, too sleepy to question, gratefully let his tired body sink down on the soft skins. Aten stirred up the fire and left him alone. Once long after, Matt roused to hear the rattle and the pounding of feet. The Indians were dancing again, and he was thankful to stay right where he was. Wow, what a really nice chapter 16 was. Like, this chapter was just all full of celebration. Think about what was being celebrated. Think about how this culture, the Native Americans, celebrated. And why did they include Matt? Do you think really in the early on in the book, the grandfather, Saskinis, was very sad about the white man, about how the white man had tricked them to sign a treaty to kind of give up their land. So do you think any bond or bridge is being built or created between the white men and the Native Americans? Interesting to think about. We'll pick up with 17 in the next video.